You want to know the moment I stopped trusting everything they taught me at the academy? It wasn't a battle. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't some grand turning point you'd put in a history feed. It was a ship. One ugly, impossible ship, sitting in a docking ring where it had no business being, and a readout on my console telling me a thing that simply could not be true. I've told this story a few times now. Each time I tell it, I notice I slow down at the same place, right at the part where I first saw her hull. So I'll warn you ahead of time. When I get there, give me a second. Some things you don't rush, even years later. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much anymore, but back then I went by Sub-Marshal Valen Corps. Third rank orbital command, assigned to the threshold stations out past the coronet belt. If that sounds important, it wasn't. The threshold was where the Galactic Concord parked officers it didn't quite want and didn't quite trust. A long, quiet edge of nowhere. The kind of post where the most exciting thing in a standard year is a fuel barge with a stuck valve, and you write it up in 3 paragraphs because 3 paragraphs is all you've got. I'd been out there 11 years. I'd stopped counting them the way you stop counting cracks in a ceiling. You know they're there. You just don't look anymore. So when I tell you about the day the human ship came in, understand this first. I am not a man given to wonder. I had wonder beaten out of me a long time ago, slowly, by paperwork and silence and the slow gray grind of a career that went sideways early and never recovered. I knew the shape of every hull class in the registry. I knew what was possible and what was not. That was the whole point of being an officer of the Concord. You knew the limits, and you enforced them. The limits were the job. The limits were the world. Humans had limits. Everybody knew the humans had limits. That's the part I need you to sit with before I tell you the rest. Everybody knew. It started on a gray shift. Out there we don't really have day or night, just rotations, and the gray shift was the dead middle one, when the station lights dim to save the reactors and half the crew is asleep in their racks, and the other half wishes they were. I was on the command deck with maybe 6 others. Talik at sensors, a sharp young officer who was too good for the threshold and knew it. Old Biscow on comms, half dozing the way she always did, one ear open out of 40 years of habit. A couple of junior watch officers I barely knew, who mostly stood very straight and tried not to be noticed. The station hummed. That low, bone-deep hum you stop hearing after the first year, the sound of reactors and recyclers, and 1,000 small machines keeping you alive in a place that wants you dead. You forget it's there. The air smelled like recycled metal and the faint burnt sugar tang of the coolant they use on Concord stations. You get used to it. You stop noticing it, until something breaks the pattern. And then, all at once, you notice everything, the hum, the smell, the cold seam of the deck plates under your boots, the exact weight of the silence right before it ends. Talik broke the pattern. "Sir?" His voice came out thin, not scared, just careful, the voice of a man double-checking his own instruments before he says something he can't take back. "Sir, I've got a contact. Inbound, no registry ping." I didn't even turn around at first. 11 years teaches you not to jump. Course. "Direct for us, decelerating." A pause. "Decelerating hard, sir." That got me. Hard meant something coming in too fast for a casual visitor. A barge ambles. A scheduled freight crawls. Hard deceleration meant somebody had been running flat out and was only now slowing down, which meant they'd had a reason to run. I crossed the deck and leaned over his shoulder. The contact was a smudge on the long range, a faint bloom of heat and motion against the dark, way out past the belt where nothing was supposed to be. Mass reading. He tapped at it, frowned, tapped again. The frown deepened. "It's give me a second, sir, the system's having trouble locking the profile." "Trouble how?" "It keeps trying to classify it, and rejecting its own answer." I'd never heard of that. Not once in 11 years, in 30 years before that. Our systems were old, but they were thorough. Every hull in known space had a signature, the way it pushed through the void, the radiation it leaked, the shape of its drive wash, the resonance of its mass. The registry knew them all. A ship the computer couldn't classify was, by definition, not supposed to exist. The registry was reality. If reality and the registry disagreed, the registry usually won, because the registry was backed by 10,000 years, and the void was backed by nothing but the truth. "Run it again," I said. "Manual override, take the assist off and let it think." Talik ran it manual. We both watched the bar crawl. The answer came back the same: unclassified, origin unknown. And under that, in the little amber warning text the system used when it really wanted you to pay attention. The text I'd seen maybe twice in my whole career. A line I will remember on my deathbed. Configuration inconsistent with known fabrication standards. Biscat had stopped dozing. She was sitting up now, both eyes open, very still. The two junior officers had drifted over without being told to, the way people do when something is wrong and they want, very badly, to be standing near other warm bodies. Nobody said anything. We all just watched the smudge grow. "Could be a derelict," Biscat offered finally. Her voice was rough with sleep and something underneath it. Something old, pre-conquered wreck knocked loose from the belt. "They drift sometimes." "Derelicts don't decelerate," Talik said. She didn't have an answer for that. None of us did. A dead thing doesn't slow down on purpose. A dead thing just falls. I watched the smudge get bigger, watched the heat bloom of its drive flare and dim in this strange, deliberate rhythm. Flare, dim, burning fuel to slow itself in pulses instead of one long, clean burn. And I remember the exact word that came into my head, unbidden, watching it. Breathing. It looked like it was breathing. No conquered ship flew like that. It was wasteful, it was clumsy. It was the kind of flying you'd do if your engines weren't quite good enough to do it the clean way, if you'd had to learn, somewhere hard, to make do with less than you needed and squeeze every drop out of a burn because there might not be another. We tune our drives to perfection because we can afford perfection. This thing was flying like perfection had never once been on offer. "Open a hail," I said. Biscat's hands moved over the board, slow and sure. We sent the standard Concord greeting on all the standard bands. Identify yourself. State your origin. State your purpose. Declare your registry. The whole bureaucratic liturgy I'd recited or sent 1,000 times until the words had gone smooth and meaningless in my mouth like stones in a river. Nothing came back. Not silence exactly, there was a carrier signal under the static, a faint structured noise like the ship was hearing us and thinking about it, weighing us. That was almost worse than silence. Silence is empty. This was full of something deciding. Then, after maybe a full minute, and a minute is very long, when you are leaning over a sensor board in a dim room watching an impossible thing come toward you, the speaker crackled, and a voice came through. Not in trade cant, not in the smooth, sanded-down Concord standard everyone learns, in something rough and warm and full of strange edges. A language I half recognized and could not place, the way you can't place a smell from your childhood close enough to ache, too far to name. Biscat's translator chewed on it, hummed, spat out a result, and then she went very quiet. "Biscat." "It's human, sir," she said, soft, like she didn't want to be right. "The language, it's one of theirs." Now I have to stop and tell you what we thought about humans back then. You have to understand it the way I understood it, or none of the rest will land. So bear with me. Humans were the Concord's quiet embarrassment. We'd found them maybe 60 years before, a small species, a single battered homeworld, a handful of struggling colonies they'd flung out into the dark on technology so crude it was almost touching. They built ships out of welded plates, if you can picture that. They used chemical rockets to climb out of their own gravity well, chemical fire, like cave dwellers throwing torches at the sky, riding a controlled explosion up out of the air because they had nothing better and refused to stay grounded. Their faster-than-light drives, when they finally cobbled some together, were the slowest and the most dangerous in all of known space. Pilots died in them. They kept building them anyway. Their hulls couldn't take a real impact. Their shields, when they had them at all, were a polite fiction. Their weapons were a worse one. Every metric the Conquered measured a species by, humans came in at the bottom, and not by a little. The official Conquered position was that humanity was a developing client species, which was the polite phrase, the one for the records. The unofficial position, the one you heard in the officers' messes over a drink, was less kind. We called them patch monkeys, because everything they built looked patched together, held with tape and stubbornness and prayer. The old engineer's joke, and we all laughed at it, I laughed at it, was that you could tell a human ship by the rust. Because no other species in the galaxy had ever managed to invent a hull metal that rusted. Everyone else had moved past corrosion 10,000 years ago. The humans were still out there scrubbing oxide off their plating by hand, like it was the dawn of time. We pitied them mostly. The way you pity a small animal that keeps walking into the same wall and getting up and walking into it again. There was even a kind of fondness in it, the cheap kind. Plucky little humans, banging rocks together, so proud of their little ships. So when Biscass said it's human, my first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion, pure vertigo confusion. Because the thing on my screen had crossed open space, alone, from a direction with no human colonies on any map I knew, decelerating with a breathing control that didn't match anything I'd ever seen a human do, and our systems, the systems that knew every hull in the registry, including the sad little human ones, the welded ones, the rusted ones. Our systems couldn't classify it. "Pull it up on visual," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Soon as it's close enough for the forward array, I want to see it." We waited. The ship kept coming, kept breathing its strange rhythm, flare and dim, like a thing alive and tired and not quite ready to stop. And then it crossed into range of our forward optical array, and the image resolved on the main display. And the command deck went completely silent. I told you I'd slow down here. This is the part. The thing was big, bigger than it had any right to be, not a warship's kind of big, not that brutal stacked mass we build for killing. Long. A great spine of a vessel with structures hung off it at angles that made no engineering sense to me at all, bracing and modules and what looked like whole sections grafted on long after the original was built, the way you'd add rooms to a house over a lifetime. It was dark, not painted dark, just unlit, running cold and quiet, the way you'd run a ship if you'd learned somewhere that being seen could cost you everything. There's a way a thing carries itself when it's spent years being hunted. This ship carried itself that way. And down its flank, catching the faint gray light of the distant belt, were marks. Not registry codes, not Conquered glyphs, not any writing I knew, marks, small ones. Hand-shaped, hand-scale, hundreds of them in faded paint and scorched metal and what looked like scratches cut straight into the plating. Rows and rows of them, running the length of the hull, some so old they'd nearly weathered away, some fresh enough to still catch the light sharp. Tallies. Names, maybe. I didn't know yet what they were. I learned later, and learning it nearly broke me. But in that moment, all I knew was that something had reached out and touched that hull, over and over, deliberately, for a very long time. A ship doesn't get marked like that by accident. A ship gets marked like that by people who needed to remember. And the hull itself. "That's not a fabrication seam," Talik whispered. He'd come up beside me without my noticing. He was staring at the same stretch of plating I was, and his voice had gone to almost nothing. "Sir, look at it. That's not extruded. That's not grown. Look at the join, sir. Look how the plates meet. That's built," I said. The word came out of me strange. "It's built by hand." "Nobody builds by hand. I need you to understand what I'm telling you, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. In the Conquered, you do not build a ship. The word barely makes sense to us. You grow the hull in a fabrication cradle, seamless, perfect in a matter of days. Or you extrude it whole from a printer the size of a small moon. Or at the cheapest, you assemble it from standardized panels that snap together with tolerances finer than a hair, machine to machine, no hand ever touching the join. The idea of a person, an actual living person, with actual hands cutting and measuring and welding and fitting plate to plate to plate by eye by feel until you had something this size, it was absurd. It was the labor of generations. It was thousands of joins, each one a place to fail, each one trusted to a hand instead of a machine. It was a thing no sane, well-supplied species would ever choose to do. And the humans had chosen to do it, out here, in the dark, where no one could help them and no one could resupply them and no one could see. Humans can't build ships like that, one of the junior officers said. He said it almost angrily. That's the part I remember. Not in wonder, in something closer to offense, like the ship had personally insulted him, insulted everything he'd been taught. They can't, sir. They don't have the orbital infrastructure. They don't have the fabrication base, the materials science, the anything, sir. A hull that size built by hand, it's not possible. It can't be done. I didn't say anything. I was still looking at the marks, hundreds of them, catching the light one after another, all the way down a hull that should not exist, made by hands that should not have been able to make it. I was beginning to understand that can't and didn't were two very different words, and that the humans, somewhere out past every map I'd ever trusted, had spent 60 years quietly proving it. The voice came through again. Biscay's translator caught up this time, smoothed it into Concord Standard, though it kept the warm, strange edges of the original underneath, so you could hear the human in it, the real voice riding under the clean one. Threshold Station, the human said. This is the freighter, and here the translator stumbled on a word, turned it over, gave up, and just rendered the sound which came out something close to Old Marigold. We're hurt. We've got wounded aboard, and we've got a hull breach we can't hold much longer. We're requesting dock. We've got nothing to trade and nothing to threaten you with. We're just asking, please. We've got nothing to threaten you with. I remember that line because of how strange it was, how wrong-footed it left me. In 60 years of Concord protocol, in all my decades in uniform, I had never once heard a ship lead with reassurance that it was harmless. Nobody does that. Everyone postures. Everyone inflates. You come into a station bigger than you are, louder than you are, full of vague implication, and you let the station guess at your real strength and decide it's not worth the trouble of finding out. That's the dance. That's how it's done everywhere by everyone. This ship was doing the opposite. This ship was telling me plainly, in a tired, cracked voice riding under a machine's smooth one, we cannot hurt you, and we cannot pay you, and we are asking you for help anyway, because asking is all we have left. You don't say that unless you've run out of every other thing to say. Sir, Talik said, quiet, urgent at my shoulder. Regulations. An unregistered vessel, unknown configuration, no transponder, we're required to refuse dock and report it up the chain. We hold them at distance and we wait for word from command. That's the protocol, sir. That's. I know what we're supposed to do. I knew the regulation by its number, I could have recited it. Refuse the unregistered. Quarantine the unknown. Forward to command and await disposition. Let the bureaucracy upstream decide whether the thing was a threat, a process that would take weeks, maybe longer, during which the Old Marigold and everyone aboard her would either patch their own breach in the cold and the dark, or they wouldn't, and we'd tow the corpse to a scrapyard and file the paperwork. That was the safe choice, the clean choice, the one that kept your record tidy and your conscience tidier and let you sleep at night because you'd followed the protocol, and the protocol was someone else's name on the dead. I looked at the marks on the hull again, hundreds of them, faded by years, scorched by who knew what, and I thought those aren't decoration. Nobody decorates a freighter. Nobody scratches a thing into a hull by hand in vacuum in the cold unless it matters more than the cold. Those are a record of something carried over and over and over down all those years. And I thought, what is it exactly that a hand-built ship full of patch monkeys has had to carry hundreds of times, enough to mark every single one. I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew I wasn't going to find it by leaving them to freeze. "Biscay," I said, "tell them Dock 7, tell them we're opening the clamps." Talik turned to stare at me. "Sir." "Log it as my decision. My name, my rank, my responsibility, put all of it in the record in ink so there's no question whose it is." I straightened my collar, an old nervous habit my hands found on their own. If the chain has a problem with it, the chain can take it up with me personally, and I'll be right here. Now move, get medical down to 7, get a repair crew standing by, and someone get me a hardsuit. I was already heading for the deck stairs. I'm going down to meet them. The walk down to Dock 7 is one I'd made 100 times for 100 boring barges. I could have made it asleep. This time it felt like a different walk entirely, down a corridor I'd never seen. The passages of the threshold are long and gray and lit, on gray shift, in that dim amber that turns everything the color of old bone. My own footsteps came back at me off the walls, doubled and hollow, and I kept thinking of all the things to think about. I kept thinking about hands. About a person somewhere with 2 hands cutting plate, measuring it, welding the seam and checking the join and moving down the hall and doing it again and again, for years, for a lifetime, because there was no machine to do it and there was no choice but to do it, and there was no one coming to do it for them. I kept thinking about what it would take to make a species that way, what you'd have to live through, what would have to be true about the galaxy for people to learn to build like that. By the time I reached the dock gallery, the observation level above the clamps, where you watch a ship seat itself in its cradle, word had already run ahead of me. There were maybe 30 crew up there who had absolutely no business being up there. Off shift, half-dressed, some of them pulled straight out of their racks, faces pressed to the long viewport. Nobody had ordered them up. Nobody had announced anything. They just come because in 11 years on the threshold, nothing had ever once been worth getting out of your rack to see. And somehow, the way a station always knows its own pulse, they all knew that this was. The Old Marigold came in slow. Through the viewport up close, she was even stranger than she'd looked on the screen. And sadder, I could see the breach now, the wound. A long, ragged tear in her flank, 2 or 3 meters of torn and folded plating, sealed over with what I can only describe as desperation made physical. A patch of mismatched plate that didn't even match itself. A fat, ugly seam of weld laid down in a hurry by someone working fast and scared. And over all of it, I swear to you on my rank, on the scrap of cut metal I still carry, a great hardened gout of some kind of foam, sprayed over the whole repair and left to set. They had plugged a hull breach in open vacuum, with structural foam and weld and whatever plate was nearest. It was the most desperate, the ugliest, the most flatly ingenious repair I had ever seen in my life. And it was holding. That's the thing. It was crude and it was wrong, and it was holding across open space with wounded inside breathing the air it kept in. Behind me, I heard one of the dock crew breathe out a single word, under her breath, almost to herself. "Patch monkeys," she said. But she didn't say it the way we said it in the mess. Not with the sneer, not with the cheap fondness. She said it slow and low and almost reverent, the way you'd say a prayer you'd been mumbling your whole life without listening, and had only just this second heard the actual words of. I knew exactly how she felt. I was feeling it too. The clamps engaged. The Marigold shuddered as the cradle took her, a deep groan running through her hand-built bones, and she seated. There was a long hiss as the dock collar reached out and tried to seal against her hull, fighting, I could hear it fighting, to find purchase on metal that wasn't shaped to any standard the collar had ever been built to grip. For a few bad seconds the seal chattered and slipped and wouldn't take, and I genuinely thought it would fail, that we'd watch them so close and lose them to a fitting that didn't match. Then it caught, bit down, held, pressure equalized with a long sigh, the board went green. And the airlock cycled. I stood at the bottom of the gallery stairs, in my hardsuit, the whole station seeming to hold its breath behind me, and I watched the inner door of the Old Marigold roll open. Steam rolled out first. Their air was warmer than ours, and whether humans run hot and humid, I'd read that somewhere and forgotten it, and it hit our cold corridor and fogged, a thick white billow rolling across the deck and curling up around my boots. And out of that fog came the first human I had ever seen with my own eyes, close enough to touch. I'd seen them in briefing footage, of course. Small, soft-looking things, the footage said. Harmless. The footage had not prepared me for a single thing about him. He was not small the way I'd been told. He was lean and hard and wound-tight as a drive about to overburn. His face was a roadmap of old scars and older exhaustion, a face that had been awake too long across too many years. And his eyes. Humans have these wet, mobile, terribly expressive eyes, and has swept across that gallery, across all of us, standing there gawking in our clean uniforms, in our clean, dry station, with our full bellies and our intact ship, and I watched him take account. Exits. Numbers. Who was armed. Where the threats were. Pure reflex, the same blind way my own hands had found my collar an hour ago. This was a creature who had learned, somewhere in his bones, that walking into a room could kill you, and who would never again walk into one without checking. He was carrying something in his arms. It took me a moment, through the fog, to understand what it was. It was another human, smaller, younger, hurt badly, wrapped tight in a blanket, one arm bound up against a body that wasn't moving the way a body should move, held the way you hold a thing you are terrified of jostling. A child. The man's eyes finished their sweep and landed on me. On my rank insignia, which he could not possibly have read, which meant nothing in any human system. And yet somehow, out of 30 bodies, he picked me out as the one in charge, the way the desperate always seem to find the one who can say yes or no. He crossed the deck toward me, this small, fierce, wrecked creature carrying a wounded child off a ship he had helped build with his own 2 hands, and he stopped an arm's length away, and the fog curled between us. "You the one who let us in," he said. The translator rendered it flat and even, but underneath I could hear the real voice, raw, cracked, scraped down to nothing. "I am," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind those wet human eyes, something working hard not to show itself. Then he shifted the child's weight carefully onto one arm, and he held out the other hand toward me, open, palm up, fingers loose. That ancient human gesture I'd read a footnote about once and never seen performed. "Then I owe you," he said, "and I always pay what I owe. You remember that, friend. Whatever else happens, you remember I said it." I looked at his open hand. I looked at the gray, still face of the child in the crook of his other arm, a child not crying, which is so much worse than a child crying, a hurt child gone quiet because she's saving everything she's got left for the next thing. I looked, past him, through the curling steam, at the impossible ship steaming and ticking in the cradle behind him. The ship our systems couldn't name. The ship covered, bow to stern, in the hand-cut marks of 100 things carried. And somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet as a seam giving way, a thing I had believed my entire life simply came apart. Humans can't build ships like that. But there it was, cooling in my dock. And here he was, with his hand open and a wounded child in his arms, and a debt he'd already sworn to pay. And I was about to learn exactly what it had cost them, what it always cost them, to prove every one of us wrong. I didn't take his hand right away. I want to be honest about that, because it's the kind of detail that gets smoothed out of a story later, and I promised myself a long time ago I'd never smooth this one. I hesitated, standing there in my hard suit in front of 30 of my own crew with a scarred human holding out his open palm. I hesitated, because some old academy reflex in me was screaming that this was beneath me. An officer of the Conquered did not clasp hands with a patch monkey off an unregistered hull. There were rules. There was distance. The distance was how we kept everything orderly. And then I looked again at the child in his other arm. The way her small face had gone gray, The way she wasn't crying, which was worse than crying. A hurt child who has stopped making noise is a child who is saving her strength for something. And I thought about my own daughter, who I hadn't seen in 9 years because the threshold was a posting you didn't bring family to, and the distance in me just broke. I took his hand. His grip was warm and dry and far stronger than a thing that size should have been. He gave it one short shake, looked me in the eye, and let go. "The girl first," I said. "Medical's right there, go." He went. I'll give him this. He didn't waste a second on ceremony. He moved through my crew like water finding a crack, straight to the medical team waiting at the bottom of the gallery, and he laid the child down on the float stretcher with a gentleness that didn't match anything else about him. He said something to her, low in their own language, that the translator didn't bother to catch. And the child's eyes opened and found his face, and she said something back, and he made himself smile for her. It was the worst smile I have ever seen. It was a man pretending, with everything he had, that the thing he was afraid of wasn't going to happen. Then the medical team rolled her away, and the smile fell off his face like it had never been there, and he turned back to me. "Name's Das," he said. "I captain the Marigold. What's yours?" "Corps." "Sub-Marshal Valen Corps." I gestured at the ship behind him, steaming and ticking as her hull cooled. "Captain Das, I have to ask. Our systems can't identify your vessel, can't classify the hull, can't trace the origin. Where did you come from?" He looked at me for a moment, and something tired and wary settled over his face. "You wouldn't have it on your maps," he said. "It got taken off." I put him in a briefing room, got him water, which he drank in one long pull and then stared at the empty cup like he hadn't seen clean water in a while. Got his surviving crew, there were 9 of them, plus the wounded child, settled into a holding berth with food and medical attention. I had Talik post a quiet watch because I wasn't a fool, but I told the watch to stay out of sight. These people had been afraid for a long time. I didn't want to add to it. And then I sat across from Captain Das, and I asked him to tell me what happened to his ship. He told me. It took a while. He kept stopping, kept going somewhere behind his own eyes, and I learned to wait through the silences. Here is what I pieced together. The Old Marigold was a freighter, or she'd started as one, a hauler built, yes, by hand in the orbital yards of a human colony I'd never heard of, a place called Tessely's Reach, way out past the edge of any map I'd ever read. The humans out there didn't have the fabrication base to grow hulls the conquered way. They'd never been given the technology, so they did it the only way they knew how. They cut plate. They welded seams. They built ships the way their ancestors had built ships on the homeworld's oceans, plank by plank, hand by hand, because that was the knowledge they had, and they were too stubborn to die for lack of a printer. It took them 6 years to build the Marigold. 6 years. A whole community working in shifts in vacuum by hand. Das said his grandmother had welded part of the keel. He said her name was one of the marks on the hull. He said all the marks were names. Every human who died aboard the Marigold or been born aboard her or saved her, scratched into her flank so they'd ride along forever. That's what the tally marks were, not survivals, people, each one a person. "We don't have much," Das said, "out on the Reach. We've got our ships and we've got each other, and that's about the whole of it. So when something tries to take one of those away from us, we don't take it well. Something tried to take the Marigold." He was quiet for a long moment. "Reavers," he said finally. "That's what we call them. You'd have a politer word. Raiders. They work the edge of your conquered space where your patrols don't reach and nobody important lives. They take ships. They take cargo. They take people sometimes, and you don't want to know what for." His jaw worked. "They've been bleeding the Reach for years, picking us off one ship at a time. And your conquered, no offense meant, Marshal, your conquered knows about them and doesn't do a thing, because it's cheaper to let the edge bleed than to defend it." I didn't argue. I knew the patrol maps. I knew the holes in them. I'd never thought about who lived in the holes. 6 days ago, Das went on, they came for us. 3 ships. Real ships, Marshal, fabricated hulls, proper shields, the kind of thing your Concord sells to anyone with the coin, no questions asked. Against our welded plate. He laughed, and there was no humor in it. Should have been over in a minute. We should have been a tally on somebody else's hull by now. But you're here. But we're here, he looked at me. You want to know how a hand-built freighter full of farmers and welders beats 3 proper raider ships? I do, I said, I really do. He told me, and I'm going to tell you the way he told me, because the way he told it mattered as much as what he said. The Marigold couldn't outrun them. Her drive was old and slow, the kind that breathes, the kind I'd watched pulse on my screen. She couldn't outgun them. She had 2 old mining lasers and a rack of charges meant for cracking asteroids, nothing built to kill a ship. And her shields couldn't take a single proper hit. So Das didn't try to fight them the way a conquered captain would. He couldn't. He fought them the way a human fights when a human has nothing, which, I would learn, is the most dangerous way anything in the galaxy fights. He let them think they'd won. He let the Marigold take a hit she shouldn't have survived. That was the breach, the long wound they'd later plug with foam, and he let her tumble, venting atmosphere, drives dark, playing dead. And the raiders, smelling an easy capture, closed in to board, slowed down, came alongside, got close. And when they were close enough that their fabricated hulls and proper shields didn't matter, close enough that it was knife range, close enough that being able to take a hit from a distance meant nothing, Das blew the asteroid charges. Not at the raiders. He didn't have a clean shot, and he knew it. He blew them against the Marigold's own hull, against the side facing the raiders. He turned his own ship's plating into a wall of shrapnel, and he flung 6 years of hand-cut human metal straight into the faces of the people trying to take her. You destroyed part of your own ship, I said slowly. I made her bleed so they'd bleed worse, Das said. Plate's just plate. We can cut more plate. You can't cut more crew. He turned the empty cup in his hands. 2 of their ships went dark in the first second. Hull breaches all down their flank, atmosphere gone, drives wrecked. Turns out a proper shield doesn't do much against a ton of jagged metal you weren't expecting from a ship you thought was dead. A thin, grim smile. The 3rd one ran, smart. We'd have done the same in his place. But he was too slow, and our old mining lasers don't miss at knife range, and well, he's a tally now too, on nobody's hull because nobody'll mourn him. I sat there and I tried to imagine it. A conquered captain would never have done what Das did. We're taught to preserve the ship, preserve the asset, fight from range where our superior technology gives us the edge. The whole doctrine assumes you have the edge. We had never once, in the entire history of the conquered, had to ask the question that every human apparently grew up answering. What do you do when you have nothing, and they have everything, and they're coming anyway? The answer, it turned out, was, you make your nothing cost them everything. You turn your own breaking into a weapon. You bleed on purpose so that they bleed by accident. And you do it without hesitating, because hesitation is a thing you can only afford if you have a margin, and humans on the edge of conquered space had never in their lives had a margin. You won, I said. We survived, Das corrected me. Different thing. I lost 4 of my crew to that fight, good people. One of them was the girl's mother. His voice didn't change, but his hands went still on the cup. She's 7, the girl. She was on the gun deck when the boarders nearly came through, and a piece of our own hull caught her, my charge, my shrapnel, my fault, and now she's in your medical bay, and I don't know yet if she's going to keep that arm, and her mother's a mark on the hull, and I am the man who decided to blow the plate. He looked up at me. So when I tell you I survived and didn't win, you understand the difference. There's no winning that. There's just the ones who get to keep going. I want to tell you what I did next, because it's the part of this story I'm least proud of and most glad of, both at once. I went to my quarters, and I drafted the report I was required to draft. Unregistered vessel, unknown configuration, engagement with hostile raiders in unpatrolled space, etc. By the regulations, I was supposed to log the Marigold as a security risk, hold her crew for processing, and forward everything up the chain to be sorted out by people who had never been within 100 light years of the edge. I wrote about half of it, and then I stopped, and I sat there in the dim, and I thought about a man who blew apart the ship his grandmother helped build, the ship with his crew's names scratched into the hull, because it was the only way to keep the living ones alive. I thought about plate's just plate, we can cut more plate. I thought about how the hull conquered, all its fabrication cradles and printed hulls and superior technology, had never produced a single captain who would do what DOS did, because we'd never had to, because we'd always had the margin, and somewhere along the way having the margin had made us soft in a place we didn't even know we had a place. And I deleted the report. I wrote a different one. I logged the Marigold as a conquered vessel in distress, which required some creative interpretation of the registry rules, but the rules were written by people who never imagined a ship like hers, so I figured they could live with my interpretation. I logged the raider engagement as a conquered security action, which made the dead raiders my jurisdiction and not a crime DOS had to answer for. And I requisitioned full repair support for the Marigold, charged to my own command budget, signed with my own name. I knew what it would cost me. The threshold was already where they sent officers they didn't trust. This would confirm every doubt anyone upstream had ever had about Sub-Marshal Vale and Corps. There would be an inquiry. There would, eventually, be a reckoning. I signed it anyway, and I slept better that night than I had in 11 years. The repairs took 9 days. My crew did them. And here's the thing I didn't expect: I didn't have to order anyone. Word had gotten around the station about how the Marigold fought, about the foam-plugged breach and the names on the hull and the girl in the medical bay. And somewhere in those 9 days, the word patch monkey stopped being something my crew said with a sneer and started being something they said with their hats off. They didn't just patch her breach. They learned from her. My chief engineer, a stiff old conquered lifer named Vant who'd never had a creative thought in his life, spent a full day crawling through the Marigold's guts with DOS's people, and he came back to me with his eyes shining like a kid's. "Sir," he said, "you should see what they did with the drive. It's wrong. Everything about it is wrong. It's inefficient and it's dangerous and it should not work." He grabbed my arm, Vant, who I'd never seen touch anyone. "But it'll run on anything, sir. Anything you can burn. We tune our drives to one fuel, perfect, no margin, and the second they can't get that fuel, they're dead in the black. These people built a drive that runs on whatever's on hand, because out where they live, whatever's on hand is all you ever get. We've been building ships for a galaxy that always has what it needs. They've been building ships for a galaxy that never does, and theirs is the one that came home." I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. We don't build ships like that because we never had to. And somewhere in not having to, we forgot how to build the thing that matters most, the thing that comes home anyway, with names on its hull and the wounded still breathing. Out of a fight it had no right to survive. The girl kept her arm, by the way. I want you to know that before I tell you the next part. She kept her arm, and on the 8th day she walked into my command deck on her own 2 feet, this small, fierce human child, and she handed me a scrap of metal she'd cut and filed herself. It was a tally mark. My name, scratched into it, in human letters she'd copied from the translator. "Das says you go on the hull now," she told me, very serious. "Das says your crew." I have commanded warships. I have held rank in the Galactic Concord for 30 years. I have never in my life been given anything I valued more than that scrap of cut metal. I kept it, I have it still. But I'm getting ahead of the story, because on the 9th day, just as the Marigold was ready to fly, the long-range board lit up again. Another contact, inbound, decelerating hard. Not human this time. The raiders had friends. And the friends had come to collect a debt, and to find out who, on a forgotten little conquered station at the edge of nowhere, had been foolish enough to help. Talik saw them first, same as before, but this time his voice didn't come out thin. It came out flat and cold, the voice of a man reading a death sentence and trying not to let it shake. 4 contacts, sir. Fabricated hulls. Raider configuration, same family as the ones the Marigold fought. They're decelerating into a standoff ring around the station. A pause. They're not running scared, sir. They know exactly where they are and exactly what they're doing. I looked at the board. 4 ships, each one of them better armed than my entire station. The threshold wasn't a fortress. It was a fuel stop with a command deck and a skeleton crew. We had defensive batteries, but they were old and they were few, and they'd been installed back when the worst thing anyone expected out here was a drunk barge captain. Against 4 proper raider hulls, we'd last about as long as it took them to decide they were bored. Bisquet had the comms up before I asked. "They're hailing us, sir." "Put it through." The voice that filled my command deck was smooth. That's what I remember most, how smooth it was, how unhurried, the voice of a creature that has never once in its life had to ask the human question, that has always had the margin and always known it. It spoke trade cant, polished and easy. "Threshold station. I'll be brief because I'm a busy person and you're about to be a dead one. You have something of mine. A human freighter ugly thing calls itself the Marigold. Its crew murdered 3 of my ships and a great many of my people. I've come for the ship, the crew, and the satisfaction of it. Hand them over and I'll only destroy your station instead of taking it apart slowly. That's the whole of my generosity. You have 10 minutes. The channel closed. The command deck was silent. 30-some faces turned to me. Bisquet, Talik, Old Vant who'd come up from the docks, the junior officers whose names I'd finally learned. And in the doorway where he'd appeared without a sound, Captain Das, with the girl's small hand in his, because of course she'd followed him, because where else would she be? I looked at Das. He looked at me. And I understood in that moment that he already knew what the easy choice was. He'd known it the second the contacts appeared. He'd lived his whole life on the wrong side of margins, and he knew exactly how this story was supposed to go. The bigger force makes its demand, and the small forgotten people on the forgotten station do the sensible thing, the survivable thing, and hand over the patch monkeys to save their own skins. He knew it because it had probably happened to his people before. More than once. That's how the edge bleeds. He didn't ask me for anything. That was the thing that got me. He just stood there with his daughter's hand in his and waited for me to be what every authority he'd ever known had been. I keyed the all-station channel. "This is Sub-Marshal Corps," I said. "All hands to defensive stations. We are not handing over anyone." I want to be clear that I did not make that decision because I was brave. I've thought about it a great deal in the years since, and bravery isn't the right word. Bravery is what you have when you weigh the risk and choose it anyway. I didn't weigh anything. I just knew, with a certainty that came up from somewhere underneath all my training, that I would rather die at the threshold than spend the rest of my life as the officer who handed a wounded child to the people who'd come to take her apart. Some lines you don't get to walk back from once you've crossed them. I'd crossed mine 9 days earlier when I deleted the first report. This was just the bill coming due. But here's the thing about that decision. The moment I made it, I expected fear to fill the command deck. Instead, something else happened. I watched my crew, my soft, bored, forgotten, conquered crew who'd never fired a shot in anger in their lives, I watched them straighten. I watched something move through them that I recognized because I'd seen it 9 days ago on a scarred human's face in a dock gallery. They'd caught it from the Marigold, like a fever. The human thing. We have nothing, and they have everything, and they're coming anyway. So let's make our nothing count thing. And Das stepped forward. "Marshal," he said, "your batteries won't hold 4 hulls. You know that." "I know that." "Then let me tell you how my people fight." He came to stand beside me at the command station, and the girl let go of his hand and went to stand very straight beside Biscat like a small soldier reporting for duty. You've got 4 ships out there that have never lost. That's their whole strength and their whole weakness both. They've got the margin. They've always had the margin, which means not one of them has ever had to think about what they'd do if it went wrong. They don't have a plan for wrong. They've never needed one. He looked at me. We're going to give them wrong. And he told me his plan. It was insane. It was the most human thing I had ever heard, and we did it. Here's what we did, and I'll keep it plain because the details matter. We didn't fight 4 ships. DOS's first rule: never fight the whole force, fight the piece of it you can reach. We powered down the station, all of it, went dark and cold and silent, vented some atmosphere on purpose so it looked like a hull breach, played dead, the exact trick the Marigold had played, scaled up to a station. We made 4 undefeated raiders believe they'd already won before they'd fired a shot, because nothing makes a creature with the margin sloppier than thinking the fight's already over. They closed in. Of course they did. They had no plan for wrong, and a dead station wasn't wrong, it was just easy. 2 of them came in close to board and picked the corpse clean, exactly the way DOS said they would, because that's what you do when you've never once had to imagine the corpse might bite. And when they were close, knife range, where their proper shields and proper hulls meant nothing against what we had, we stopped playing dead. We didn't fire the batteries first. DOS's second rule: they're braced for the obvious. Hit them with the thing they didn't think to fear. The Marigold was docked at 7, repaired, fueled, and the humans had spent the dark and silent minutes loading her cargo bays with every loose piece of cut plate and scrap metal on the station. And the Marigold, the ugly hand-built freighter their friends had died trying to take, came off the clamps hot and dumped 6 tons of jagged human shrapnel straight into the face of the nearest raider at knife range, exactly the way she'd done it 6 days before. The raider's shield held against the first impacts and then simply ran out of the thing shields run out of, and the rest of the shrapnel went through it like it wasn't there, and the ship that had never lost came apart in a spray of atmosphere and light. Then we fired the batteries into the second close ship, which was still turning, still confused, its captain still trying to understand how a dead station had a live ship, because he had no plan for wrong, and the wrong was happening too fast for him to catch up. Old Vant ran those batteries himself. He told me afterward his hands didn't shake once. 2 volleys and the second raider was tumbling dark. 2 ships gone in under a minute. The 2 that had come in close, the 2 that had been sure. And the remaining 2, the smooth-voiced one and his last companion, hanging back at range where they thought it was safe, did the thing DOS had told me they would do, the thing creatures with the margin always do the first time the margin fails. They froze. Just for a second. One single second where 2 undefeated raiders, suddenly down half their force to a station they'd already counted as dead, simply did not know what to do, because nothing in their lives had ever taught them what to do when winning stopped being automatic. 1 second of wrong with no plan for it. 1 second is a very long time if you've spent your whole life on the edge of a margin, learning to use the seconds other people waste. The Marigold was already moving. DOS had never stopped moving. While the 2 close ships died, he'd taken his ugly hand-built freighter wide and low and dark around the station's bulk, the way no conquered captain would ever fly, breathing his strange pulsing burn, and he came up underneath the smooth-voiced raider out of the station's own shadow where their sensors weren't looking, because their sensors had never had to look there, because nothing had ever come at them from underneath before. He didn't have shrapnel left. He didn't have much of anything left. He had 2 old mining lasers meant for cracking rock and knife range, and a daughter watching from my command deck, and a hull with his grandmother's name scratched into it. It was enough. It's always been enough for them. That's the thing we never understood. It's always somehow been just barely enough. The smooth voice came over the channel one last time, and it wasn't smooth anymore. It was the sound of a creature meeting the human question for the first and last time. What are you people? The channel cut. The fourth ship ran. Smart. We let it go. Das said you always let one run so there's someone left to tell the story so the next ones think twice. The edge bleeds less when the things that bleed it learn to be afraid. The threshold held. We lost no one. A child's scrap of cut metal with my name on it rode through the whole fight in a dead station's command deck. And when the lights came back up, the girl was still standing very straight beside Biscay. And the first thing she did was look at her father coming back through the airlock. And the second thing she did was cry. Finally, the way she should have been allowed to cry days ago. Das came up to the command deck steaming and exhausted, and he found me, and he held out his open hand again, palm up. This time I didn't hesitate. I told you, he said, I always pay what I owe. You paid more than you owed. He shook his head. No such thing, not between crew. He nodded at the girl who was scrubbing her face and pretending she hadn't been crying. You go on the hull, Marshal. You're one of us now. That's not a small thing where I come from. It's about the only thing we've got. The inquiry came, of course. It came about 3 months later, after the Marigold had long since flown home to Thessaly's Reach with her crew and her child, and a hold full of proper Concord repair parts I'd signed over without authorization. They convened a board. They reviewed my creative interpretation of the registry rules, my requisitions, my deleted first report, the whole tally of every line I'd crossed. They asked me to account for myself. I told them the truth, all of it. The ship our systems couldn't name, the names scratched into the hull, the drive that runs on anything because the people who built it never once had what they needed. The 4 undefeated raiders who froze for 1 second because they had no plan for wrong, and the small hand-built freighter that had spent its whole existence learning to live inside exactly that second. I told them that the Galactic Concord had spent 10,000 years building ships for a galaxy that always had what it needed, and that I had watched a species that never had anything build the one ship that came home. I told them I'd do all of it again. The board didn't quite know what to do with me. I think they'd expected an apology. In the end, they did the bureaucratic thing. They reprimanded me, formally, for the registry violations, and then they quietly tripled the patrol presence around the edge of Concord space near Thessaly's Reach, which was the thing I'd actually been asking for the whole time, and they never said the two decisions had anything to do with each other. The edge bleeds a little less now, not enough, but less. I'm an old man as I tell you this. I left the Concord years ago. I didn't leave angry, I just found I couldn't go back to building ships for a galaxy that always had what it needed, not after I'd seen the other kind. I went out to the edge instead. To Thessaly's Reach, where the humans build ships by hand, plank by plank, name by name, the slow, stubborn way their ancestors built boats to cross an ocean nobody had ever crossed. I'm not much of a welder, but I've learned. There's a mark on the keel of the newest ship in the yard that I cut myself badly with my own 2 hands. It's my granddaughter's name. She's half human now by marriage, which is a thing the Academy would never have believed possible and which is the truest thing in my life. People still come through sometimes from the Concord. Officers like I used to be, in clean uniforms, with the registry running in their heads. They look at our ships, the welded plate, the rust we still haven't bothered to engineer away, the drives that breathe, and I watch the exact thought cross their faces that crossed mine, 11 years on a forgotten station ago. Humans can't build ships like that. And I always tell them the same thing. The thing I learned in a dock gallery from a scarred man holding a wounded child, the thing 4 undefeated raiders learned 1 second too late, the thing the whole vast comfortable Concord spent 10,000 years being too well fed to understand. It was never about whether they could. It was about the fact that they had to, and they did anyway, every single time, with nothing, against everything, and they kept the names of everyone they lost scratched into the hull so that even the dead got to come home. That's not a ship you build because you can. That's a ship you build because you refuse to disappear. And there is nothing in this galaxy, no fabrication cradle, no printed hull, no margin however wide, that has ever once stood against a thing that simply refuses to disappear. We just never had to learn it. They never had the luxury of forgetting.